Welcome to the video for chapter 34 of the Cambridge Introduction to Sanskrit, which is going to introduce you to the periphrastic perfect and to ta participles ending in na. First of all, the periphrastic perfect. Now, for two kinds of verbs, Sanskrit uses an alternative so-called periphrastic perfect formation. First of all, it uses it for derived verbs such as causatives and desiderative, and also some class 10 verbs which are formally very similar to causatives. And secondly, it uses it for a number of verbs that begin with a long vowel, so that have a root initial long vowel. Why would we need such an alternative perfect formation? Well, if you remember, perfects are formed on the basis of the verbal root. The root is reduplicated and then appears in guna, usually in the strong forms, and in zero grade in the weak forms. Derived verbs have the exact same root as their corresponding basic verbs. So, for example, bharati and its causative bharayati are both derived from the root bhr. Therefore, the perfect of a derived verb form would be indistinguishable from the perfect of the basic verb. And therefore, we need an alternative perfect form for the derived verbs so that we can distinguish between the past tense of he carried, the perfect of he carried, and the perfect of he caused someone to carry, he made someone carry. Then, in verbs that begin with a long vowel, we actually would have a reduplicative syllable that would be invisible. So, for example, of iksh, to see, we would have the reduplicative syllable I. Verbal roots that begin with a vowel reduplicate just that vowel. And so if we have I, the reduplicative syllable, plus iksh, the root, then those would contract to iksh, and that would look just identical to the root. You would not see the reduplicative syllable there. So, if you have the use of an alternative perfect form, that would then make the perfect of such verbs more easily recognizable as a perfect. What then does the periphrastic perfect look like? Well, it has three elements. First of all, we take the present stem, which could be a derived stem such as causative bharaya, or a basic stem such as iksha. To that we then add am, giving us either bharayam or iksham or a comparable form. And then, depending on whether we want an active or a middle periphrastic perfect, we add either the required form of the perfect active of either as to be or bhu to be or kr to do, or we add the required form of the perfect middle of kr to do. So, for example, a periphrastic perfect in the active of bhr, to carry, we get the causative stem bharaya, and from that we might then get bharayam asa. I caused someone to carry, where asa is the first singular perfect of us. Or we could get bharayam asima, which means we caused someone to carry, which involves asima, the first plural perfect of us. If, on the other hand, we want to form a middle periphrastic perfect, let's look at two examples involving the root as, meaning to sit. From as, we get the form asam, and that we then combine with the required form of the perfect middle of kr. So, for example, we might get asam chakri, I sat, with the first singular perfect middle chakri, or asam chakri re, they sat, with the third plural perfect middle of kr, namely chakri re. And finally, something entirely unrelated, and also perhaps slightly paradoxical sounding, namely ta participles ending in na. Now, most Sanskrit verbs form their past participle by adding ta to the verbal root in zero grade. For example, from kr, to do, we get krta, having been done. From bhu, to be, we get bhuta, having been, and so on. A few Sanskrit verbs, however, add na instead of ta to form this participle. And the meaning of both of these formations is entirely identical. The difference is just in the form. We cannot predict which verbs are going to use na. We can just say that by far the majority of verbs use ta. Among the small number that use na, we have a certain number that end in d. And most frequent among those probably is sad, meaning to sit, from which we get the participle sanna, meaning having sat, and therefore seated. A small number also end in a vowel, so for example, vocalic R. And when this vocalic R comes to stand in front of that na, it changes into ear, or more rarely ur. So for example, from stir to stru or to scatter, we get stirna, having been scattered, or simply scattered. Or also tur, meaning to cross, from which we get tirna, having crossed. More rarely, we also get roots that end in long a or short e or short u, i.e. other vowels. And perhaps the most frequent among those is from kshi, to destroy, the alternative past participle kshina, which exists alongside the more regular kshita, and both of them mean destroyed, having been destroyed. As we said a second ago, we cannot predict which verbs have this na participle. So from a practical point of view, what we need to do is remember that such na participles exist. We need to learn to recognize them, and we should remember the most frequent ones, which are sanna, meaning seated, and on the basis of stirna, we stirna, which means spread out, and therefore great. That was it for this chapter. We hope that you found this video helpful, and if you have any comments or suggestions, we would love to hear from you. Please do write to us at rupal@cambridge-sanskrit.org. And now, for your own work on this material, good luck and have fun!